name is Amy Freud. I'm chair of the History Department here at UMBC, and I welcome you to our annual Robert K. Webb Lecture. This is also a co-sponsored event with the Humanities Forum of the Drescher Center for the Humanities, and we want to thank them for their support. I want to say a few things about what's coming up next on the docket for the Humanities Forum. So the next event will be Wednesday, November 13th at 6 p.m., is that correct? In the University Center Ballroom, so not here. The Department of Africana Studies will be presenting the 41st annual W.E.B. Du Bois Lecture. Pretty exciting, 41st. The talk is The Future of Du Bois, Consciousness, Citizenship, and Epistemology in Africa. This will be a talk given by Nimi Wariboko, professor and chair of the Philosophy, Theology, and Ethics Department at Boston University. So I hope you will join us at that next event. Today's event, as I said, is our annual Webb Lecture, and the History Department hosts 2 lectures each year, the Webb Lecture in the fall, the Augustus Lowe Lecture in the spring. The Webb Lecture is named after our former colleague, Robert K. Webb, who was a founding member of UMBC's History Department. And he was an eminent historian. He was president of the American Historical Association, our large professional organization in the United States. He was editor of the American Historical Review, the most renowned publication. And he was also chair of UMBC's History Department. He himself was not a U.S. historian, although he ran so many U.S. institutions. He was a historian of modern, particularly Victorian Britain. And so we have a strong tradition of British history at UMBC that goes back to Professor Webb and is continued by myself and my colleague, Professor Ritzel. It takes 2 of us to make up for Bob Webb, I guess. Actually, probably takes more, right? But Bob Webb was somebody who was very attuned to different trends in the historical field, started out as a political historian, but then moved toward what we call more social and cultural history, was very interested in philanthropy, in Unitarians, and even at the end of his career started to look at issues of gender. So he was somebody who was always changing with the times, and in keeping with that, we like to invite Webb lecturers who are innovative, doing new things in their field, and I think today's speaker is not going to disappoint in that respect. So I am very excited to say that this year's Webb lecturer is Professor Amy Stanley of the History Department of Northwestern University, and she's going to be speaking to us today. I just realized I lost your title. It's right. Urban History as Global History. The view from Edo, the greatest city in the world. As a British historian, I might have to dispute this. Right? My colleague Constantine Porras will introduce our speaker. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. As an Edo historian, I second that sentiment. It's my great pleasure to introduce more formally our speaker today, whom I've known for a number of years and whose work I greatly respect. Dr. Amy Stanley is Associate Professor of History at Northwestern University, where she began teaching in 2007, following the completion of her PhD at Harvard University. Her undergraduate degree, a BA in East Asian Studies, summa cum laude, was also from Harvard. Looking at her rather impressive vita, it becomes clear that Dr. Stanley has, over time, become increasingly concerned with the global and with connecting the micro with macro phenomena. She teaches a variety of courses at Northwestern that reflect her interest not only in Japanese history, but also in global history, including one she's teaching this very semester at Global History, 1500 to 1850, and Gender History as Global History, and a seminar, Till Death Do Us Part, Exploring Marriage. That global interest is also reflected in her publications and in her professional activities, such as her chairing a panel called Global Microhistory at the AHA annual meeting in Chicago this past January, and in the title of her talk today. Dr. Stanley splashed onto the academic scene in 2012 with their monograph, Selling Women, Prostitution, Markets, and the Household in Early Modern Japan, published by University of California Press, 2012. The book takes the reader on a journey across time and space in Japan during the early modern or Tokugawa period. It presents compelling micro-histories of individual women and weaves them into a provocative narrative that compels us to rethink basic categories and concepts such as marriage and prostitution. It makes a valuable contribution in revising the outdated notion of the Tokugawa as a dark age for women and the historical nadir for female status and authority. Its use of a wide range of documentation that is skillfully employed and woven into a highly readable narrative results in what one reviewer described as a compelling work that is more typical of a mature scholar rather than a young scholar's first book. Confession here, I was that reviewer. I hope that wasn't too tacky. Since her first book, Dr. Stanley has been quite busy publishing articles and giving talks around the country. In 2016, she published an article in the American Historical Review, the premier journal in the field of history, entitled Maidservants' Tales, Narrating Domestic and Global History in Eurasia, 1600 to 1900, which gives you some idea of her not only geographic but also temporal sweep. This article was recognized with the prestigious Berkshire Conference of Women Historians Article Prize in 2016. She also has a number of other articles that have either been recently published or are forthcoming, and their titles give you an indication of the verve that Dr. Stanley has brought to the field. For example, Everything Has a History, Japanese bullfrogs. Forthcoming this fall in Perspectives, which we look forward to. Fashioning the Family, a Temple, a Daughter, and a Wardrobe, in an exciting new book called What is Family? Answers from Early Modern Japan. And then Writing the History of Sexual Assault in the Me Too Era, that was in Perspectives on History in November of 2018 and republished in Slate. Although she won't be talking about that today, perhaps during her prepared remarks, but perhaps during the Q&A someone might query her about that. Dr. Stanley's research is largely based on original brush-written documentation. Learning to read this kind of resource requires considerable effort and dedication. Her paleographic skills are such that she was invited to serve as an instructor at the Graduate Summer School in Early Modern Japanese Paleography at the University of Cambridge. Dr. Stanley's scholarship is proof that possessing such skills is essential if one is to do highly original work and not have one's research paradigm limited by what others have determined is important enough to publish in printed text. Her work utilizing the letters written by a woman named Tsuneno, the daughter of a Buddhist priest who goes to live in Edo, will be published in book form in her forthcoming title, Stranger in the Shogun City, A Japanese Woman and Her World. The research for this book has been supported by 2 major grants, a Fellowship for Advanced Social Science Research on Japan, and a National Endowment for the Humanities Faculty Fellowship. The book will be published by Scribner, a press that has hitherto been more associated with publishing the works of literary luminaries like Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Stephen King, rather than the work of early modern historians of Japan. That obviously is going to change. It will be published in at least 3 other countries besides the US, in Britain, in mainland China, and in Germany. The promotional material for the book describes it as, quote, immersive and fascinating. Stranger in the Shogun City is a revelatory work of history, layered with rich detail and delivered with beautiful prose about the life of a woman, a city, and a culture. Given her other work to date, this blurb is no doubt absolutely accurate. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Amy Stanley.
Thank you so much, Constantine, for that wonderful introduction. I'm too conceited now to give this talk. In all seriousness, I am honored to be here today to give the Webb lecture. Thank you again to Constantine and to Amy Freud for arranging my visit. I am actually from Maryland. I grew up not far from here, so this talk is kind of like a homecoming to me. I'm really happy to be in my native state. So I'm here today to talk about Edo, the greatest city in the world. We're going to get rowdy, I think. So in 1800, the era of Atlantic revolutions, Napoleon, and declarations of independence, the greatest cities the world had ever known were rising at the mouth of harbors and on the banks of rivers. Some of them were the well-established seats of empire. Istanbul, home to something like 650,000 people, Beijing, with a population of 1.1 million. Others were old capitals and newer metropoles, London and Paris, the former turbocharged by the nascent Industrial Revolution, which contained 850,000 and 550,000 people respectively. And a few were colonial cities, though New York only contained 60,000 people, barely a town by old world standards. So when Hamilton tells you that New York on the eve of the revolution is the greatest city in the world, do not believe it. In fact, the largest city in the world was none of those places. It was Edo, the Japanese shogun's capital, the city that would one day be renamed Tokyo. It was a behemoth that contained an astonishing 1.2 million. Yet Edo is curiously absent from global history. In college-level textbooks, it is more likely to appear as a culture than a city. In Worlds Together, Worlds Apart, which is probably the most popular text used in global history courses in the United States, Edo appears in a section titled Cultural Identity in Tokugawa Japan, and there are three subheadings: Native Identity and Popular Culture, the Influence of China, and European Influences. Kabuki theaters, woodblock prints, and brothels take center stage, and the people who formed the audiences, the labor, and the clientele recede. And because there seem to be no people, there are also no social problems. Governance, provisioning, housing, riots, famines, etc. don't feature at all. I tend to think of this representation of Edo and its history as one of a culture without a society. And it's actually most striking in the realm of visual representation. Time and again, Edo's artistic production stands in for an idea of the global, the source of iconic pre-modern, non-Western images, but the society, the people who produce those images, are obscured. And this is my favorite example, not to pick on Mark Kishlansky, who is actually one of my teachers in graduate school and in undergraduate, and who I really admired very much. But this is his Sources of World History, Readings for World Civilization. And you can see here there's a woodblock print of Edo. And in fact, there's actually the word Edo, 8 views of Edo, this image says. The contents of these is a series of documents for reading about the world. They end in 1500. So Edo doesn't appear at all because Edo didn't exist until 1600. So this is a perfect example, right, of the image of Edo being used to stand in for some idea of the global, but the content of Edo is just completely elided. Now, this is not only a problem of textbooks. In synthetic works of global history aimed at a scholarly audience, Edo also recedes. So for example, we have Frank Trentman's excellent study of global consumer culture in the early modern and modern eras, and it mentions Edo exactly twice, even though it was the world's largest urban market for the entirety of the 18th century. Tokyo, as the city was known after 1868, receives much more attention, often in the context of adapting Western food and fashion. And London features dozens of times, even in its tiny early modern iteration. C.A. Bailey's The Birth of the Modern World does not focus on urban history and mentions few individual cities. Edo doesn't appear at all. And in Jürgen Osterhamel's magisterial overview, The Transformation of the World, A Global History of the 19th Century, Edo does appear, but only briefly, even though there's a whole chapter on cities. And also, the population count is wrong. So in Osterhamel, Edo ranked 6th among global cities in 1750, with a count of 492,000 residents, which is under half of the actual number. So what is going on with this? Why would such an enormous city, which survives to the present as a super famous megalopolis, just disappear? Or, at best, appear in the form of two-dimensional, decontextualized woodblock prints? My guess is that some of the difficulty incorporating Edo into global history stems from a problem with categorization. So most of the urban centers that are visible and legible in this field were either nodes of empire, as imperial or colonial cities, or hubs of global trade. And this explains why we see London, Istanbul, Beijing, etc. It also explains why modern Tokyo is so hyper-visible in global history, because it was both a metropole and a nexus of global trade. But before 1868, and the birth of a new city called Tokyo, and Japan's modern era, Edo was a strange city, neither imperial nor colonial. The Japanese emperor lived miles away in Kyoto, and in any case, 18th century Japan was not an empire, but a complicated confederation of quasi-independent domains dominated by a military ruler called the shogun. Edo was not a hub of global trade either, since the shogun routed foreign commerce through the edges of his polity. So, for example, these places that I've circled in purple are the places where foreign trade comes to Japan in the era I'm talking about, the Tokugawa era, 1600 to 1868. This is a modern political map of Japan, so some of the places that exist on this map don't exist in the Edo period. The red dot, Tokyo, is Edo in the period I'm talking about. And here you see, here's the southern city of Nagasaki. That's where trade from the Dutch East India Company comes. Here's the island of Tsushima, which manages trade with the Korean peninsula. And up there, that circle in the north is Hokkaido, where there was a trade with the indigenous people who were living on the island of Hokkaido, which at the time was called Ezo. So you can see that that trade, it gets to Edo eventually, but it's not coming directly into the city. This meant that although Edo's people consumed foreign goods and knowledge, books, maps, eyeglasses, chintz, magnifying glasses, etc., they did not live in what I would call a cosmopolitan city. Unless a delegation from Korea or Ryukyu or the VOC happened to be visiting, the only language spoken on the streets of Edo was Japanese. And this was definitely not the case in other large cities, including Beijing, London, and Istanbul, that are legible in global history. Viewed from this perspective, Edo's invisibility might be the product of a blind spot in the most common variety of global history, which focuses on interconnectedness. The most obvious ways in which the world was connected in the early modern era were through trade and empire, the movement of goods and people. Edo was at the outer edge of this web, and it tends to disappear, along with places like Hangzhou in China, huge cities that were not necessarily as cosmopolitan in terms of their population or their economic orientation. The geographical dimensions of this problem are similar to those identified by historians of pre-colonial Africa and Latin America, who have long argued that global history functions to elevate some regions over others. Places that were not quote-unquote connected tend to recede from our view. In the case of Edo, I think this problem is compounded by the lingering effects of Orientalist scholarship, which conferred upon East Asia the status of civilization and denied it a history. From this perspective, it makes sense that the shogun's great city is so often represented as a culture without a society. While New York, roughly the same age as Edo, is explained in terms of its youth, social dynamism, and explosive change over time, the Japanese city's history is sketchy and schematic. In global history narratives, though not ours in Japanese history, the merchant class rises so that it can produce and consume art and entertainment, and conflict and violence go unmentioned. What's particularly frustrating about this silence is that it's definitely not the product of a sparse documentary record or a lack of scholarship. Edo Period Japan was one of the best documented societies on the planet, and there is a vast secondary literature on Edo's social history, which highlights conflict and pays close attention to the survival strategies of the urban poor. But it is almost entirely in Japanese, and therefore it is inaccessible to scholars in the Anglophone world who don't have specialized language skills. And as Jeremy Edelman has noted recently, the field of global history has remained stubbornly Anglophone. The impetus to explore new places has not resulted in the embrace of scholarship that originates in those places. A failure or inability to account for secondary scholarship in other languages doesn't just result in problems of interpretation, it also results in problems of fact. A misunderstanding of Edo's social history appears to be the source of this mistake that I just showed you. So this number, as I said, is under half the number of the population of Edo. And the original citation for this figure, when you trace it all the way back to where it first came from, is Sekiyama Naotaro's work on the population of Japan in the early modern era, Kinsei Nihon no Jinkou Kouzo, from 1969. This book does contain this number, but it is referring to the population under the jurisdiction of the Edo City Magistrate. Now, if you don't know anything about Edo's social history, you might think, okay, the population under the jurisdiction of the city magistrate, that's the population of the city. But it doesn't count samurai, who were over half of the city's population, who were a different status group not under the jurisdiction of the Edo City Magistrate, nor does it count all the people who lived in temple and shrine lands, who are also not under the jurisdiction of the Edo City Magistrate. So without an understanding of the social history of Edo, you can't just lift the numbers. The numbers are impossible to interpret. And this results in a kind of endless feedback loop. Edo is diminished because its history isn't adequately represented or explored. And because it appears diminished, it is not adequately represented or explored, etc., etc., etc. And this really is unfortunate interpretively, because what the city of Edo has to offer is a very deep social history of a city that was neither imperial nor colonial, that was not a hub of global trade. And this is important, I think, for two reasons. First, it means that the flows of influence from the outside world weren't so overwhelming that we can't isolate any of them. So in some ways, Edo is actually an ideal space in which to explore what the historian Prasenjit Dwara has called Convergent Compare Sin, an investigation of how, in his words, circulatory global forces are institutionalized in different societies, creating parallel responses in places that were distant in space and sometimes in time. The second reason Edo has immense potential as a site for global history scholarship is that it gives us rich documentation on the urban poor, and particularly women, who are often overlooked in the big sweeping stories of mobility and connectedness that comprise a lot of the field of global history. So I'm going to take advantage of both these opportunities today in my story of urban consumption and political backlash in Edo in the early 1840s. My main protagonists are not the usual subjects of global history, or really even the history of Japan in the early 1840s. They aren't samurai or political figures or the heads of merchant households or even kabuki actors or writers. Instead, they are the city's lower class women. One often overlooked fact about the population of the city of Edo is that the gender ratio among commoners changed dramatically over the course of the Tokugawa period from 1600 to 1868. So the first reliable census of the commoner wards didn't take place until the 1720s, and it counted about 313,000 men as opposed to 170,000 women. So that's a very skewed ratio. That's the first count that you can see here. So here I've given the population of women, commoners, in orange, the population of men in gray, the total population in blue. But over the years, the commoner population slowly approached parity in terms of gender, and by the time of the early 1840s, it was something like 295,000 to 255,000, and by the end of the era, 1867, the counts were almost even, 269,000 to 268,000. There's some debate about why. One explanation is that Edo used to be dominated by these huge firms with armies of male apprentices. And over time, they gave way to smaller stores and mixed-sex families started to predominate in the city. Another possible explanation is that women started to migrate to the city in larger numbers, although it's hard to substantiate this with population records. We can get into that later. And yet another suggestion is that infant mortality rates fell. And so you had more children being born into the city and surviving in roughly equal numbers. But there is no question about the effect, and that is by the 1840s, there was a higher proportion and higher absolute number of commoner women and children in the city than there ever had been before. And these women were also highly visible on the streets. Population records from the late Edo period and the first years of the next period, the Meiji period, show that back alley tenements were full of families, sometimes in unorthodox configurations. There were women living alone, with brothers, with several small children, and of course with husbands. And these women did all kinds of things. Many took in piecework and laundry. So they worked in the tenements, just like the male artisans who wove tatami mats, made eyeglasses, etc. There's a lot of kind of tenement room-based production in Edo. But it also wasn't uncommon for women to commute to work as maidservants or waitresses, or for them to work as the peddlers of various kinds of things, like peppers or charcoal or plants. And this meant that people could see them out and about. What were these women wearing on the streets? An array of evidence suggests that they were wearing eye-catching, fashionable clothing, even if they were relatively poor. What working women wore on the street seems to have been mostly printed cotton, and particularly a style called santome stripes. And I will get into the name santome stripes later. This person here at the bottom is a sumo wrestler. The woman at the top is a wealthy woman out to see plum blossoms, and the santome stripes is this vertical style of stripes on the clothing. Silk crepe was also gaining in popularity. Usually as underclothes, this red that the woman has under her outer robe is probably red silk crepe underrobe. But also people were wearing silk crepe as outerwear. A book published in 1843 pointed out, it used to be that it was unusual for anyone apart from samurai to own a coat made of patterned or striped kaga silk. But now, even among back alley craftsmen, there's no one who doesn't have one. The visual record of Edo's woodblock prints also suggests that servant women and peddlers were quite well dressed. And so this is Utagawa Toyokumi's book, Ehon Imayo Sugata from 1802. There are 2 volumes of this book. One is dedicated to women who worked in the sex trade. The other is dedicated to other women, and it has everything from courtiers in Kyoto, to people in the emperor's courts, to commoner women out on the streets of the city. And in this depiction, you can see several types of women. The woman in the back in the purple is manufacturing cotton batting. And then you have a woman who seems to be carrying around a tray of tofu. Then you have a woman in green who I want you to notice, because I'm going to come back to that in a minute. She's wearing this kind of patterned cotton, and she's just labeled as old lady. And then you have this woman who is a seller of nori, so seaweed, and then you have a nice looking mother and daughter on their way to lessons. On another page, also picturing a back alley scene, this is a half of the picture is a bathhouse. On that side, and then on this side is an employment agency. There are 2 geisha coming out of the bathhouse, so you don't have to worry about them. But you could look at this woman who is delivering the plants, and then also this woman who is a childminder, so she's like a nursemaid, and then the women at the employment agency, all of them very nicely dressed. And if you go back in time a little bit, this is Tori Kiyonaga Fuzoku Azuma no Nishiki. You can see a woman selling plants, and look at her outfit. Look at that green that she's wearing. This is the same green on the old lady here. And so I like to imagine it's the same woman. She kept the robe. She grew up and had a nice retirement in a back alley as a kind of back alley old lady. Of course, there's no actual way to substantiate that. So here we need to be really careful, because artists were portraying beautiful women and probably exaggerated the quality of their clothes. But the depiction of working women in striped and printed cotton is pretty consistent. And if you look closely, you can also see something else, and that is a lot of laundry hanging out. And the presence of laundry, and this again is Santome stripes hanging out in the back alley. This presence of laundry hanging out in back alleys also appears in other sources, including the shogunate's commendations for filial piety. Every so often, the shogunate would single out people who had been really good to their parents and give them rewards, like silver pieces or some rice. And then they would publish the stories of these very good sons and daughters. And in one of them, a poor woman in Edo is commended because she hung her mother-in-law's laundry away from the prying eyes of her neighbors so that the mother-in-law wouldn't be embarrassed by her incontinence or the stains on her clothes. So if you think about it, this hanging laundry in the back alleys was an astonishing display, a series of announcements, each of which advertised a small luxury, a change of clothes to wear, while the other set was washed and dried. We also know about Edo clothing standards among working people from commentary about what kinds of clothes were considered unacceptable. The very poor suffered from a chronic shortage of clothing, and it was this detail that marked them in their neighbors' eyes as truly destitute. The connoisseur of Edo gossip, Fujioka Yoshizo, who wrote a famous diary called Fujioka Nikki, described one family's indebtedness. The wife wore only a bathrobe all the time, so she was practically naked. The daughter had only one underrobe, and she was 16 or 17 and a natural beauty. The son and his father Shintaro shared clothes, and they were in a lamentable state. They were really living in poverty. So here a lack of clothing or shared clothing marks a lamentable state. And you can see the same type of attitude toward the mostly naked men who worked doing manual labor. Some who had no clothes turned to thievery. In the early 19th century, a samurai who went by the pen name Buyoinshi complained, "Naked as trees in winter, year by year, poor people cause ever greater disturbances. Many engage in petty theft, such as stealing people's belongings while they're in the public bath." Others, unable to afford cloth, relied on cheaper substitutes. A full-sized robe could be fashioned from a few dozen sheets of thick paper, and they could be dyed any color, although they could never be laundered. And for people who couldn't even afford those, there were also garments made of used paper, which still bore the faint traces of the things that people had scribbled on the paper. And when these enjoyed a brief bout of popularity as kabuki costumes, people imitated them by wearing fine silk adorned with random scribbling. So this is like an upmarket version of street style. Of course, clothes weren't only useful to wear. They were also a form of capital available to be sold or pawned. We know a lot about Edo's used clothing markets thanks to the scholarship of the great urban historian Yoshida Nobuyuki, who has traced many of the networks of buying and selling used clothes. Clothes in relatively good condition could be pawned, or they could be sold to the peddlers who came through the alleys looking for deals. Some would turn up again in used clothing markets in the Tomisawa-cho neighborhood, which is near the theater district, or at stalls along the Kanda River. And this is a depiction of those stalls selling used clothing outside the Kanda River in Edo Mishozue, which is a guidebook to Edo published in the 1840s. But you can see all these people out looking at all these kimono and jackets and things that are hanging in stalls by the river. Things in very bad condition could be sold to men called ragmen who came through the alleys. They'd sell those rags to paper manufacturers who made low-quality paper for scribbled drafts and tissues. And of course, thieves knew that clothing was as good as cash. And the used clothing stores and pawn shops that catered mostly to the working poor made it easy for thieves to quickly dispose of their spoils. This is why people who had suffered thefts in Edo usually made the rounds of local pawn shops to try and recover the things that had been stolen. So this was the situation of the city in the early 1840s. Commoner women and children were more visible on the streets, and a robust market in used clothing meant that many of them could afford to dress in colorful clothes, particularly bright cotton prints, and they could even do their laundry. They also relied on clothing as a form of capital, which they could dispose of if they needed access to cash, and often did. But this situation was disrupted in 1841 with the onset of a political crisis known as the Tempo Reforms. Those of us in Japanese history know the story of the Tempo Reforms quite well, usually according to the paradigm Naiyu Gaikan. troubles at home, and threats from abroad. In the conventional story, the domestic and foreign elements of this crisis are neatly separated. The domestic crises include the catastrophe of the temple famine of 1833 to 1837, 4 years of bad harvest that culminated in a year of mass fatality, and a samurai named O Shiohei Hachiro's short-lived rebellion in the city of Osaka in 1837. On the foreign side of the ledger, we have the catastrophe of the First Opium War in China, which defense-minded Japanese samurai watched with mounting horror, eventually reaching the conclusion that Japan could not possibly defend itself in a conflict with a Western naval power. In 1841, so the conventional story goes, the ambitious shogunal elder Mizuno Tadakuni took advantage of the powerful retired shogun's death, capitalized on the domestic and foreign crises, and inaugurated a series of political reforms. They imitated previous reforms in the 18th century, which aimed to increase tax revenue, and they also included provisions intended to bolster defense. So, for example, Mizuno ordered shogunal regiments to drill with howitzers outside Edo, and they wore Western uniforms and took their commands in Dutch. And in the grand tradition of shogunal reforms, Mizuno's reforms also targeted manners and morals in the city, cracking down on pornography, prostitution, and conspicuous consumption in the shogun's great city of Edo. This part of the reforms is sometimes considered kind of an afterthought, especially in Anglophone literature, because it seems to so obviously be a retread of previous reform edicts, which failed. And sumptuary regulations are boring. So you'll get like 100 different notices about appropriate sandals and various types of silk, and it just doesn't seem that compelling compared to drilling with howitzers outside Edo. But if you look closely at the Edo notices on consumption, particularly their enforcement mechanisms, it becomes clear that something new is going on. They are targeting lower class women and children to an unprecedented degree. Inspectors associated with the city magistrates examine the dress and conduct of maidservants, hairdressers, the wives and daughters of backstreet tenants, abortionists, peddlers, shamisen teachers, and waitresses, that is, lower class women. They did this specifically, sometimes by revising earlier reform edicts that had been aimed at wealthier women. So, for example, in 1843, the range of forbidden fabrics was extended from silk crepe to fancy designs woven onto cotton. Meanwhile, hairpins were prohibited for being too showy, even if they were actually inexpensive. And the edict says this: if they're showy, even if they're actually inexpensive, they are prohibited. So the issue here was not status inappropriate consumption per se, but the pursuit of eye-catching style. And the people who were targeted were often lower-class women who were out on the streets. The commoner headman of Suzuki-cho, one of the wards in Edo, was appointed as a reform captain, so one of the commoners who was responsible for delivering the edicts and also for informing the city magistrate what was going on. And he made a point of mentioning to the city magistrate's office that maidservants were going to hairdressers and that they wore velvet thongs on their sandals. On another occasion, regular city inspectors reported that back alley tenement women and even day laboring women never put up their own hair. They paid a hairdresser to do it for them instead. Inspectors also noted that the wives and daughters of lower-class townsmen were wearing silk crepe aprons, and that back alley women had taken to wearing their padded short nightclothes out on the street. The silk crepe apron and the padded night jacket as day wear were opposing but equally disturbing symbols of disorder. In reality, you don't want to wear silk crepe for housework. It's incredibly impractical. So making an apron out of silk crepe is this disturbing juxtaposition of wearing something that seems like it should be used for work but is actually impractical for work. So it's a paradoxical accessory that symbolizes the pursuit of fashion at the expense of actual women's labor. In contrast, the equally inappropriate phenomenon of nightclothes as daywear probably signified poverty rather than luxury. But when wealthier women imitated the practice, as the inspectors warned that they would, this exigency became a fashion that threatened the class and status hierarchies that structured city life. The fashion culture of the theater district in Edo was singled out for criticism. For example, the interim inspectors for the city magistrate's office complained in 1841, "Recently, clothing has become extravagant and luxurious, and so when there is an edict, people will obey it for a time, but before long, the women among the lower orders will come to disregard it. They make no preparation for falling into poverty and instead just glom on to whatever is popular. We hear that within these households there are fathers and older brothers who understand that they must not buy glamorous clothes and try to regulate the behaviors of their wives and daughters. But of course their daughters just want to imitate whatever the leading performers are wearing, so they wheedle and coax, and their fathers end up having to spend unreasonable amounts of money." An intense focus on lower-class women as producers and consumers of fashion distinguished the enforcement as well as the conception of the reforms. The shogunate's inspectors and reform captains typically apprehended ordinary women out on foot in public places. In fact, a group of policemen at one point complained that rich matrons were hiding in palanquins and thus escaped their view. The policemen wanted to pull them out and see what was going on with them. And here are some typical examples of who was apprehended. In early 1842, the magistrate's men seized 10 women who had just been to a hairdresser because their hair looked very nice. Around the same time, they also detained 3 women on pilgrimage to a city temple: a brothel keeper's wife who wore crepe robes in a fine pattern, a townswoman who had 2 crepe underrobes and a velvet obi, and a tenant's daughter who wore light brown silk crepe. All 3 were prohibited fabrics, but they were not particularly extravagant outfits by the standards of the time. As the reform progressed, even women wearing cotton became targets. In the spring of 1843, the magistrate's men arrested 4 women in their 20s, tenant shopkeepers' wives and daughters, while they were out enjoying cherry blossoms, because their robes were showy. Fujioka Yoshizo, the famous diarist who wrote Fujioka Nikki, commented, "A heavy punishment for trifling people, all cotton down to their linings, not a hint of silk." The actual punishments, which were usually a time in manacles or a period in house arrest, and a fine for the household head, may have been less worrisome for women than the menacing, humiliating experience of being apprehended. In 1841, one of the inspectors seized a woman on her way home from a shopping expedition and ripped a silk kimono off her body, or tried to at least. It would be difficult to actually accomplish that. Some commoners employed as enforcers bound women around the waist with straw ropes, a standard practice when apprehending criminals, but one that even the overzealous magistrate acknowledged was unnecessary in these particular cases. Meanwhile, samurai policemen had to tell the commoner reform captains that it would not be appropriate for them to investigate whether women in plain cotton robes were wearing silk crepe underwear. Even if such incidents were rare, and I have no way of quantifying them, they did attract attention. And so it is not surprising that the magistrate's men reported early on in the reform era that the women of the city were frightened and confused by inconsistent enforcement. Nor is it surprising that women stopped getting their hair arranged because they were quote-unquote afraid to stand out, or that city stores marketed cheap, sober cotton fabrics as what they called gochui mono, be careful goods. The problem for both magistrates and the women under their purview was that the reforms did not police conspicuous consumption. Instead, they made ordinary consumption conspicuous. For magistrates, this made it difficult to distinguish between permissible and transgressive fashion. For lower-class women, it made them conscious of their own visibility in new ways. So while the reform was a short-lived phenomenon, mostly over by the end of 1843, it was real for the women hairdressers who, if the inspectors can be believed, hurried through the streets hiding their hairpins, trying to find clients at night when it was easier for them to escape notice. It was also real for the poor women who had survived for years through cycles of pawning clothes. Reports said that the pawn shops would barely even take anything because they'd been inundated with clothes. Mostly this was because people needed cash to get through the economic crisis, but it might also have been people parting with things that they couldn't safely wear. Used clothing stores weren't buying either. As people disposed of their conspicuous clothing, the pawn shops only paid half of their normal rates. For people surviving day to day, this was a significant crisis. I just wrote a book about a woman who worked as an Edo maidservant in 1843, and she complained in her letters that she could barely get 2 shu for 1 bu worth of clothes at the pawn shop. That is, she could only get half of what she thought they were worth. Day to day, she wrote, "I never know where my next meal will come from, and this is the kind of place where if you look bad, you can't even go out on errands." So you see this kind of this tension between keeping up appearances, which is really necessary, and the fear of standing out, and the fact that it's impossible to keep up appearances if you can't pawn your clothes to get some cash. So for hers and for others like her, the tempo reforms really were their own crisis. There are many ways to tie the story of Edo's tempo reforms to the larger scale of global history. The most obvious strategy is to follow, to some extent, the conventional troubles at home, threats from abroad narrative that I gave you briefly at the outset. The shogunate's tempo reforms were partially inspired by fear of encroaching Western imperialism, and one side effect was the hobbling of Edo's economy and an increased and unwelcome attention to what women were wearing on the street. I think that is, in fact, an important part of the story, one in which the First Opium War had a ripple effect that temporarily changed the lives of lower-class women in Edo. Even those who had never heard of Britain, had never been to China, did not smoke opium, and weren't even wearing imported clothes. But as I said at the outset of this talk, I'm more interested in the idea of what Dwara has called convergent comparison, in tracing the influence of circulatory global forces. And here, one can tell a completely different story, one in which the circulatory global force is something that I didn't mention at the outset: the dispersal of Indian printed silk and cotton textiles via the Dutch East India Company in the 17th century. So, that laundry hanging on clotheslines, the clothes in the pawn shops, the robes ripped off Edo women in the tempo reforms, none of it was imported. Almost none of it was imported. But almost all of it was printed cotton and silk. And this was the consequence of a major shift in Japanese material culture during the first half of the Edo period. So at the beginning of the 17th century, wealthy urbanites wore silk, and people in the countryside mostly wore hemp. But by the mid-18th century, cotton textiles were available across the archipelago, and the commercial revolution in the countryside had opened up a new market for silk in a greater variety of colors and patterns and at new price points. Another driver was Japanese import substitution. In the case of silk, strict limitations on the import of Chinese silk starting in 1685, accompanied by the rapid intensification of domestic silk manufacturing, meant that there was a lot more silk and printed silk available. And of course, the initial success of printed cotton as a luxury good in the 17th century spurred Japanese peasants to start cultivating cotton and Japanese producers to develop the technology for printing patterns like the ones they'd seen on the Indian cloth that was coming in from the Dutch East India Company. And this meant that fashionable clothing became accessible in a limited way to working people in the countryside and in the cities. And even those who didn't even have the means to buy cotton felt that they were expected to keep up a certain fashionable appearance. This explains all of those paper robes dyed in different colors. These standards of respectability extended not only to dress, but also to hair. During the tempo era, the inspector said that even maidservants would visit the hairdresser to get their hair set rather than walking around with messy higami, that is, like hair you just like put up yourself like this. What I'm talking about here in the dispersal of cotton textiles is this san tome stripes, which you can see here on the sumo wrestler and then those women enjoying plum blossoms. The word san tome comes from Sao Tome, which is in the area of Chennai in India, which is the producer of these original cotton textile stripes that were adapted by Japanese who were manufacturing them. And this is nice hair versus higami. So this is the same series that I showed you before. This is a woman, the woman holding her baby on her back. She's selling edamame. And she has messy higami, which is just kind of put up in a bun like this. And then this woman is labeled as a hairdresser. And you can see her looking at the woman walking by like, oh, I could do a better job with that. So these new standards for self-presentation also help to create and sustain a secondhand market. In Edo, as in London, respectability, that central 19th century virtue, was something to be bought and, in times of need, pawned. Those are Peter Stallybrass's words about London. And here's something that I think has generally been missed in the global history scholarship. Not only the primary market for new clothes, but also the secondary markets for used clothes. The network of pawn shops and youth clothing dealers were really important for bridging city and countryside all over Eurasia and also in North America. And everywhere, this created new survival strategies for urban women who pawned their clothes and their families' clothes to survive in times when they find themselves short of cash. Historians of Britain have called this the economy of makeshift, and detailed the ways in which the urban poor, and particularly women, improvised to make a living. This included both licit and illicit pawning, as well as stealing clothes. And it's striking how the complaints of theft, detailed by Alison Toplis in her study of early 19th century England, are similar to those of Buyoinshi in Edo. That is, poor people seizing the opportunity to steal other poor people's clothes so that they can pawn them. For the slightly less desperate, that is, people who may have resorted to the pawn shop fairly often but didn't really need to steal their clothes, the secondhand clothing markets presented a new opportunity to buy new things on a regular basis, to combine clothes in different ways, and also to follow trends. As the reports to the city magistrate's office suggest, these street trends could filter from kabuki actors to ordinary women, or they could filter from tenement women to wealthy matrons who copied their outfits. Lower class women were showy even when they were wearing cheap cotton. They invited admiration and they inspired imitation even from their social betters. So it wasn't just respectability that these young women were after, although this was a basic requirement of working and going out on errands in the city. It was also style, distinctiveness, and visibility. This is what the secondhand market supplied. And as we saw in the case of the temple reforms, shogunal officials found this threatening, and so incidentally did the commoner officials who were the ward headmen. It wasn't just wearing prohibited fabrics that were inappropriate to status, such as expensive silk on maidservants. It was style itself. It was showiness, bright colors, that provoked the anxiety that the magistrates responded to so decisively and at times violently. This, too, is a familiar story, though in Europe it has been examined in a different context. As is well known, when calico became widely available in Europe, it enabled more than just the rich to display clean shirts. And because it was so easily dyed, it could mimic different fabrics, and so it brought the appearance of satins, velvets, and lace within the reach of working people who couldn't afford it before. This provoked anxiety about social leveling. In the words of a Frenchman commenting in 1759, "It is not their low prices, it is fashion, and it is a certain vanity that makes women of the lower classes so curious about calicos. Dressed in lighter printed cottons, they think themselves no longer at the same level of women at their social station. They think themselves superior to their social condition because ladies of quality too wear calicos." This anxiety was also present in England, where, as Chloe Wigston Smith argues, the stylishness of female domestic servants wearing cotton, so-called calico madams, was a major theme of pamphlets that criticized these women for both sexual license and a lack of loyalty to their own country. During the calico crisis of 1719 to 21, the conduct of the weavers raged against ordinary women on the streets. This is because calico competed with wool, which was domestically produced. And so weavers who worked with wool were angry about women on the streets wearing calico, which was imported cotton, and threatening their own business. And so there are all these instances in which weavers attack ordinary women out on the streets wearing calico. And this behavior is a lot like the behavior of the commoner enforcers sent out by the city magistrate's office in Edo a century later. One woman testified in England that she was assaulted by a multitude of weavers who tore, cut, and pulled off her gown and petticoat by violence. The rationale behind the calico crisis and the tempo reforms was ostensibly different. Weavers were upset that calico competed with domestically produced wool, and the British government was concerned about maintaining a favorable balance of trade. In contrast, the shogunate had an abstract issue with conspicuous consumption that was aimed at lower class women, but had no specific economic or foreign policy rationale. But targeting fashionable urban women, particularly lower class women, during times of economic crisis and foreign threat might be what Dwara would call a convergent political response to the global circulation of printed cotton textiles. So, I think this possibility has some important implications for both historians of Japan and for global historians. First, I think that thinking about domestic Japanese issues in a global frame forces us to reevaluate causality. The easy explanation for Edo's tempo reforms is that Mizuno Tadakuni was copying previous reform edicts and got kind of carried away with his enforcement. This is an explanation that's entirely internal to Japan. And you can see this in the quote by the Edo city magistrate Toyama Kagemoto at the end of the reforms. He said, "Even Mizuno Tadakuni thought things had gone too far when the magistrates began punishing women for their silk crepe undergarments and hemlinings." But you can see something else in that quote too. And that, I think, is that misogyny has its own explanatory power. Misogyny has been relatively under-theorized in history, especially in comparison to related concepts like patriarchy and gender, which we're much more familiar and comfortable with. That's probably because the hatred of women doesn't seem like a particularly illuminating or interesting idea. But recently, the feminist philosopher Kate Mann has offered a reinterpretation of the concept of misogyny. Rather than an individual attitude of hatred, which an individual can espouse or reject, she defines misogyny as a general climate of hostility to women who invade male-coded space, aspire to male-coded authority, or refuse to perform female-coded emotional labor. She calls misogyny the enforcement arm of the patriarchy. And she argues that it targets some categories of women more than others, and, for example, poor women more than rich women. The tempo reforms were clearly misogynist. It wasn't an accident that they targeted women and lower class women specifically, just as they were becoming more visible on the streets and also in popular culture. This is something we can only see clearly if we look at the examples of this kind of targeted violence in other places. And it illuminates those other histories too. So French or British regulations on lower class women's fashion can be seen primarily about political economy. And the violent enforcement on the streets can be interpreted as a kind of secondary effect of that policy. But what if misogyny is actually the point, and the motivation, and the thing itself? Then, in Japanese history at least, Mizuno Tadakuni's idiosyncrasies don't really seem that idiosyncratic. They seem to be part of a larger global pattern. Finally, one of my goals recently has been to find a place for lower class women, particularly Japanese women, within narratives of global history that have elided and obscured their experience of living and working in an interconnected world. This is an important feminist point that I think needs to be continually reiterated. Recently, there's been an interesting discussion about the future or futures of global history among Jeremy Edelman, David Bell, Richard Drayton, and David Motadal in the Journal of Global History and in other venues. It covers all sorts of interesting things: nationalism, scale, cosmopolitanism, history from below. But to the extent that it addresses gender, it is as a metaphor. Quote, "There is no way back from the global turn in our century, any more than we could go back to a history which paid no attention to women or the poor," Motadal and Drayton write. Yet it seems to me that we're still not very good at paying attention to women and the poor in early modern global history, with the important exception, actually, of people who were trafficked in the slave trade and transported across oceans. The urban poor tend to capture our attention only when they start some kind of revolution, and in fact, that doesn't really happen very often. Populations of poor and working people in cities have traditionally been the purview of social history, which is intensely attentive to context, unapologetically and very productively local. And that type of social history is exactly what we have in Edo Period Japan in abundance. So the historian of Japan, Shel Guerin, recently wrote of Japan scholars' comparative advantage when it comes to global history, and he defines this as language learning, access to Japanese. And I've tried to argue some version of that as well, but I actually think it's really something else. And that is, it's this amazingly rich history that's written by Japanese scholars, some of which I've tried to cite in this talk, that makes it possible to know nearly every block of Edo, every turn of the used clothing market, exactly how one would rent a tenement or buy a new coat or get one's hair arranged. And it's also the documentary record, which I've exploited here, the visual record of woodblock prints and paintings, ordinary people's letters, the absurdly comprehensive records of the city magistrates' offices, and all the other ways in which a highly literate population reflected at length about life in their own city. And this can allow us to make connections and highlight protagonists and explore social dynamics that give us something to say to the rest of the world, and especially in places where you can't see those things in such granular detail. So I have to admit my title today was tongue-in-cheek. Edo, of course, was not the greatest city in the world. That's really not a determination that anyone can make with any objectivity. But it did have one of the deepest and most significant archival records of any early modern urban society on the planet. And it's this record that makes it possible to know things about Edo's poor and its markets that we just don't know for other places. And it's the wealth of sophisticated secondary scholarship available in Japanese that allows us to interpret it. So as beautiful as all these woodblock prints are, we can't end by just splashing them on the covers of things and pretending that we've done our part for the global. Edo had a culture, beautiful culture, yes, but it also had a real, living, vibrant society full of actual people. So let's explore all of those things. Thank you.
Want to take some questions?
Of course. Happy to take questions. Yes?
Well, I have two questions. Number one, I'm a little confused with the whole magistrate having trouble distinguishing permissible people from poor people. Why was he having such a difficult time in Edo?
So it's probably, I need to explain more clearly who the Edo City Magistrate was. So there are two Edo City Magistrates, North and South. They're both samurai administrators who work for the shogun. They're in charge of basically everything in the city. They're the hardest working officials in the entire realm. In fact, they often die in office, it's said, because they were totally overworked. But one of the things that they were responsible for was enforcing these edicts about conspicuous consumption, and they did so by sending out policemen, working with commoner reform captains, and also sending out these guys called enforcers, fingertips, basically. They were called fingertips. And they were basically gangsters. And they were not supposed to employ gangsters, but they did anyway because gangsters knew the city really well and could use violent coercion, right? And there are stories of people like getting a wallet stolen, and then he would go to the Edo City Magistrate's police officer and have, tea with him, and he'd call in his enforcers, and he'd get your wallet back by the time you were finished having tea, right? Because they knew, the criminals knew how to apprehend other criminals. So what the Edo City Magistrates did is that they would issue an edict saying, like, silk crepe is prohibited, and showy clothes are prohibited. But that's really, so silk crepe is easy to say, okay, silk crepe is prohibited, but everybody's wearing it, so what do you do? Or showy clothes are prohibited, so how do you interpret that? So the interpretation is left to the policemen, who are patrolmen out on foot, and their commoner gangster-like enforcers. And so the enforcers, I think, although it's not really in the documentary record because they're not supposed to be employing them in the first place, so they're kind of obscure, are just grabbing women they think look nice because they went to the hairdresser or because they just look nice. And so that's a kind of targeted, I think, misogynist enforcement that doesn't really have to do with the text of the edicts. Because if I were to say tomorrow, blue jeans are prohibited, what would we do about that, right? I mean, if everybody's wearing jeans, like what do you actually do? So that's why it's difficult to enforce these edicts.
So basically they employ gangsters to examine who's considered rich and who is just breaking the law, wearing clothes that's considered royal?
So, as we know from policing today, it's often easier to apprehend poorer people than it is to apprehend richer people because rich people are protected, right? And it's hard to just haul them off the streets with ropes, right? And so it makes sense that they're targeting lower class women who are out on the streets. Yes?
So one thing that I find fascinating about is that the upper class, the upper classes were like adopting like that, for example, like the paper, like the written on paper style in their fabric, and that's kind of like imitated fashion of rich adopting poor. I feel like you can see it all over fashion history. So I just find that really fascinating.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that the Edo city magistrates in their edicts are really concerned about, and the mechanism for it seems to be theater. Just like popular culture is today, right? So lower class women and men are wearing things on the streets. That gets picked up by actors who are playing lower class characters often in their kabuki plays. And then more wealthier people go see the kabuki actors or see the prints of actors in these plays wearing specific things. Although that's complicated because the prints don't necessarily accurately reflect the costumes, etc. But then they want to look like the actors, so then they adopt that style too. And the Edo city magistrates are very conscious of that dynamic, or at least their inspectors are, because they say sooner or later samurai women are going to start wearing these night clothes as day wear, and that's inappropriate. So they know. That seems very modern, right? And it's already happening in the 1840s. Yes?
So my understanding is during the period you're talking about, Japan was pursuing policies of seclusion, trying to repress foreign traders and so on to a heavy degree. And I didn't hear you say much about that. I was wondering about both that impact on Edo's lack of global standing and how it also would influence her everyday life.
Yes, so this is a very important topic in Japanese history that has been highly revised. So at first, decades ago, people used to say that Japan is a closed country, and they used the word sakoku, Japan is closed to foreign trade. And then a new generation of historians several decades ago started pointing out, well, that's actually not right. That's only really true if you're talking about European trade. And it's true that the Dutch East India Company had to trade through Nagasaki, but look, there's a lot of trade with indigenous people. In Hokkaido, there's a lot of trade with Korea coming through Tsushima, really a lot in volume, surprisingly. And there's also trade with China that comes through the Ryukyu Kingdom, which is now Okinawa. So we really need to revise this. It's not a closed country, it's just they've limited trade in certain ways. In my work, though, that's a difficult issue because it's true that trade was going on with the rest of the world, and it's true that people in Edo had eyeglasses and that people were consuming foreign things to some extent. But the scale is different than it is in other places, like cities of the same size, such as London, for example. And so in my work, I tend to more emphasize the idea of import substitution, that because they restricted certain types of trade in silk and in cotton textiles, that the Japanese domestic market had to take over producing it. So I do think that, yes, this is why Edo is neglected, because it's not a hub of global trade. And people don't feel like they should have to talk about it because it's not connected. But I do feel like we lose out a lot if we don't think about places that aren't connected in the conventional ways of trade and empire. So somebody back, yes?
So at the beginning, when you talked about the edicts, you had spoken about how it was much more flashy for historians to discuss Charlie the Howitzers and Taylors and Dutch. And I wondered, as we got further in, is the adoption of these edicts on women, is it an expression of an attempt to hit that European standard of modesty, or is it instead an attempt to enforce an expected patriarchal modesty on these women in more like Buddhism?
Oh, so I think it's actually neither. So it's definitely not European standards because that is not something that the city magistrates are conscious of or thinking about. Buddhism and consumption is a tricky topic. I suppose you could say that, and in fact I've worked on a Buddhist temple family, that conspicuous consumption is incompatible with Buddhism because you're not supposed to be attached to earthly things. In fact, Buddhist temple priests were notorious for buying all sorts of fancy clothes, and you could see their inventories that they had like gorgeous things. So I don't think it was about really modesty. It wasn't about sexual modesty, at least. It was about consumption. It was about the inappropriate spending of money on frivolous things for women that should not be important. And they're disrespecting their fathers, who surely don't want to be spending all this money on hairpins and, you know, fancy cotton robes, and would rather spend it on, you know, some kind of more productive endeavor. And it is also a kind of ideology of common people should be producing things. They should make things. And in fact, peasants should be making rice. And, you know, people in the city should be manufacturing tatami mats or whatever. They shouldn't be going around splashing their money around on fancy clothes and entertainment. So that is also part of it. So it's both status and class, but it's also patriarchy, right? Like the father should be in charge of this. Why are these women going around in these pretty clothes? Yes?
In the context of Edo's invisibility in sort of global history narratives, one thing that I was wondering as you were talking is that one narrative in global history is that these major trade hubs throughout the world are also disease vectors and spread epidemics. And I was curious if the case of Edo provides a counter-narrative of what was happening there, because there wasn't the same global center of trade. And do the woodcuts show epidemic disease, and how does that fit into the narrative of global history?
This is a really good and interesting question, because so Japan doesn't have much plague, and until later on in the 19th century, it doesn't have cholera, that kind of quintessential 19th century disease. It does have measles and smallpox, but it's not clear that Edo is an urban graveyard to the extent that a place like London is an urban graveyard, so it creates this kind of demographic black hole that people migrate there and then they die. So that's a kind of well, true. So that is kind of an interesting question in global urban history that I don't know much about and would like to know more about, because I'm not quite as current on that literature about epidemic diseases. There is a wonderful set of prints and kind of ephemera about measles epidemics, and particularly one that hit in 1862. In which there's a huge measles epidemic, and there are all these prints about how to avoid getting the measles. And there are certain foods you eat and certain foods you don't eat, and also like about the the god of measles, like showing these measles demons and people fighting them off. So yes, epidemic disease is something that is known in Edo, and is probably more prevalent in the city, right, than in the countryside where it's more sparsely populated. But as for the effect comparatively, I'm not sure. Yes?
I was curious about, so with Sankin Kotai, and how, I want to know what your idea is on how it affected the population of women coming into Edo, especially through the hostage system. And then by the 1860s with the deregulation of it and how it affected it there. And taking it back to what you said at the beginning and how that constant movement of people might have affected how others saw the population of Edo and why it might not be seen as a mass global city like we see now.
This is a good question for Constantine, actually. Whatever I say here is informed by Constantine's work, unless I say something wrong, and that's just me. So you're referring to the fact that the Edo period political system is that you have all of these quasi-independent lords of different domains, and the shogun requires them to live 1 year out of every 2 in Edo, along with their retinues of samurai that they bring with them, and to leave their wives and hostages, wives and oldest sons, heirs, as hostages in the city. And so every domain has a compound in Edo, which is almost like a foreign embassy in the sense that it is that domain's territory, even though it's in the shogun city. And you have people coming in and out, and Constantine wrote a whole book on this. It's wonderful, and you should read it. So I think one of the ways that it affected the migration of women. So first of all, almost all of the people coming in and out through the Sankin Kotai system were men. It was very unusual for men to bring their wives with them unless they were very high-ranking samurai. But they wrote a lot of letters home about Edo, and a lot of letters about what they saw, and they sent home descriptions of kabuki and descriptions of fashion and descriptions of hairstyle. And so through partly this phenomenon, Edo became a place of aspiration for women as well as men, some place that you wanted to go, you wanted to see. It was fashionable, it was stylish. And so I think that idea of aspiration of going to the city to wear better clothes and to look nice and to kind of participate in this exciting like social formation was a driver of women who migrated to the city. Yes?
Just to add on to that, a point we talked about earlier, this has to do with your point about why Edo is invisible, orientalizing Japan by saying that it's large. Those who acknowledge that the population of Edo was over 1 million say it was due to, it's an artificial city. Its population was inflated and as a result of this forced system of mobility, the alternate attendance. So that, as if that discounts it as being major.
Yeah, so we shouldn't count any of the clergy in Rome, right? Right? I mean, that's just, I don't know, that's ridiculous.
Let's see if we have one more question.
Do I have any women?
I'm not sure it's formulated really yet, but I was inspired by this comment on migration, and you mentioned briefly the connection between fashion and labor, and I was reminded of like contemporary China. You have floating population from the countryside to the cities. Many of them are women from the countryside, and they use things like cell phones as symbols of fashion and communicative video. So I was just kind of inspired by your talk to think about those connections, and maybe say more about the labor and fashion connections.
Yeah, so one of the things that I sometimes say in a different version of this talk is that we think often of the intense focus on working women and their visibility and their fashion as modern. So in Japanese history, we focus on this with the modern girl of the 1920s, right? All of a sudden, women are visible in the city. And that's not exactly the case, right? So you can see already in the 1840s, and of course in other early modern societies, that this is already an issue. And so I want to actually think more about this So I love like the modern girl literature. There's a wonderful volume called The Modern Girl Around the World, which I teach all the time. I think it's great. But I would also like to think about this more comparatively in time as well as space, because I think there would be some interesting parallels that we could draw.
Well, we have a wonderful reception that we want to let you get to, but I also want to invite you to come up and ask more questions if you have them. This doesn't conclude the question portion of the day, and I want to thank Professor Stanley for a fabulous talk.